Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for an exciting episode 4. This is Let's Talk Water New Mexico, which is a podcast put on by New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium. This is a podcast that is designed and intended to share details around treated produced water and how it can play into the solutions for the challenge around water supply in the Southwest. I'm Evan Lamoureux, and I'm one of your hosts for this podcast.
I'm Liz Jolly. I'm the other host with you. In this episode, we're going to discuss some of the human health and environmental safety aspects associated with treated produced water. We are joined by some of the leading experts today from around the state on the topic. We have a great opportunity to be here in person at the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium annual meeting.
Yeah, it's great to be here in Las Cruces at New Mexico State. Before we jump into the conversation, we do want to mention and encourage everyone to take a listen to episodes 1, 2, and 3 if you haven't done so already. They're great episodes to kind of set the stage for the discussion today, and they'll talk a little bit about the challenges around water supply and some of the factors that are contributing to those challenges. And it'll also cover some of the details around treated produced water, the history, and then some of the treatment options.
So let's get started with introducing our guest today. First, we have Dr. Josh Butler from ExxonMobil. Josh, will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invite. And I'm Josh Butler. I've been with the company for 14 years now. I'm an environmental scientist by training, but served various environmental roles over the tenure of my career.
Thanks, Josh. Next, we have Dr. Pei Xu. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. It is a great pleasure to have this opportunity to communicate our research. I'm a professor in environmental engineering at New Mexico State University. I also serve as the research director of New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium. I have been working on produced water treatment and reuse for the past 20 years.
Awesome. Thanks, Pei. Next, we have Dr. Cloelle Danforth from the Environmental Defense Fund.
Hi, thanks for having me here. I am a senior research scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund. I'm an environmental engineer by training with a focus on water, and I've been with the EDF for about 7 years, working on produced water in one way or another since I started. Before that, I did some consulting, and before that, some teaching, so doing a lot of different thinking about chemicals in the environment.
Thanks, Cloelle. And our fourth guest is Rose Galbraith from New Mexico Department of Health.
Hi, I'm Rose Galbraith with the Department of Health, and I'm the drinking water epidemiologist. I've been in that role for about 6 years and with DOH for 8. Prior to going into public health, I have a background in environmental science and molecular biology.
All right. Well, thank you all for those introductions, and thanks for being here with us today. All right. Well, let's jump into our discussion. Let's kick it off with how all this work got started around the risk and toxicology of treated produced water. Cloelle, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So the Environmental Defense Fund has been in this space, produced water, for the better part of a decade. And as Rick McCurdy pointed out earlier, we're a pretty small group. We've been grappling with this for most of that time. One of the projects that EDF was involved with sort of kicked off back in 2007, which was a multi-stakeholder effort under the Groundwater Protection Council, or GWPC, to put forth a white paper exploring reuse opportunities and challenges along with suggestions for the path ahead. Within that report, which was published in June 2019, it was split into 3 modules. One that looked at sort of the regulatory and legal framework, produced water reuse inside of the oil field, and then research needs for produced water outside of the oil and gas operations. So my colleague Nicole Saunders led that 3rd module. I was a co-author along with a lot of others. And that report has kind of been, or I should say that module, has been a guiding work that created for this framework that we've developed here, which we'll talk a lot more about later. But this particular effort in New Mexico is designed to be led by science based on that GWPC framework.
Yeah, those are really good points. A good introduction, Cloelle. I think that, when I take a look at the GWPC, the most interesting and most impactful part of that paper is the fact that it breaks down the important phases when you think about risk. And it is, what are the research needs that are designed to inform the risk assessment process? And then based on that risk assessment process in which, we're currently developing within the consortia, how can the risk managers or regulators set standards that are informed by the science that you're talking about, I think, which is critical to the success of this effort.
And I just wanted to add how impressed we are with the New Mexico Environmental Department's commitment not to permit this activity until the science can help them more fully understand what the real risks are that need to be addressed.
All right, thanks for answering our first question. Well, before we talk about the work the consortium is doing around human health and environmental safety, let's talk about environmental and human health exposure and hazards. Let's start with some definitions. First off, what is risk and how does it relate to public health? Rose, let's start with you.
So, from the public health perspective, a risk is something that can be harmful to human health or have adverse or poor health outcomes, particularly at a population level. That's really our focus in public health. And the risk would depend on the potential for people to be exposed, environmentally exposed to different hazards. And again, a hazard is something that might cause injury or might cause harm. And in public health, we really want to focus on how these hazards can be mitigated to minimize the risk, to lower the risk. And that's really what the work of the consortium is helping to inform that process. And I'm just speaking for the human health perspective. Of course, we're also concerned about environmental impact.
For environmental impacts, if we discharge the hazardous materials to the rivers, then this will affect the aquatic life, such as fish. And also, if the hazardous materials are discharged into the soil, this will affect the soil health, the microbial communities in the soil, and also there could be the bioaccumulation of the toxins in the plants. And then we also need to think about there is the food chain, because if the hazardous would accumulate in the plants, then it could be consumed by the animals, and then it will further affect the public health.
You know, when I think about fairly complicated subject like risk, I kind of think about it in terms of, what are the hazards and then what are the exposures. On the hazard side, think about, what are the potential constituents of concern? What are we concerned about? And on the exposure side, it's more so around we have identified the constituents. Now, where do they go in the environment and how could they potentially come into contact with humans or the environment? So that's kind of like a very simple way to understand like what is risk. It's a function of hazard and exposure.
Yeah, and I just want to add that bit of context that goes along with risk and hazards. Like, we can eat chocolate, but our pets can't. So that's a different hazard. Or we can eat vinaigrette, but you can't put it on your plants. So thinking about what is going to receive or be impacted by those different types of toxicological hazards is really important in thinking about how we might put that produced water, that treated produced water in the environment, and how it will come in contact with different receptors.
As I hear you talking about the risk and the exposure, that ties really good to the previous podcast around treatment, right? And so, reducing the exposure and knowing what those constituents are that can have adverse effects, you can either take them out through the treatment and knowing that they're removed, or reducing the exposure by not using it in certain applications.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about that a little bit more too later. I mean, that's exactly the basis for why we're developing this framework.
So, Cloelle, we've discussed a little bit about risks and exposure in general and hazards. Can we dive a little bit deeper, talk about risk assessment in this context around treated produced water?
Sure. Yeah. So hazards can be a lot of different things. As Rose pointed out, it's anything that can cause harm. Specifically here, when we talk about treated produced water, we're talking about chemical toxicological hazard. So what are the toxicities associated with constituents of concern that are found within produced water? And then ultimately, we want to understand how and if humans or organisms or plants, whatever we put into the environment, can be exposed to those. And if they're exposed, is it at a concentration that can cause harm? So do we care about how much is in the environment relative to our own adverse effects from being exposed to those things? So untreated produced water has a variety. It's a very complex, variable waste stream that changes over the life of a well. As soon as if you poke a hole in the ground, you're going to get water. If you go deep enough, you're going to get water that's been associated with ancient seabeds, with hydrocarbons. We add chemicals to that process to sort of develop those wells and to bring oil and gas back. You put all of those things together, and in high temperature and pressure, you're going to have byproducts and reactants. So it's a salty chemical mess. And so to even characterize what's in that produced water is a challenge. Things that have been identified in untreated produced water, there's known baddies associated with petroleum hydrocarbons. We've got constituents that are known carcinogens, these PAHs. We've got some metals, including mercury and arsenic. We have, occasionally we see biocides. These things are designed to control microbial growth. And then when you mix all of those things together, you don't really know what that effect is. So when we treat the produced water, we kind of have to re-examine, did we remove those things, and did we remove them to a level that is sufficient?
Yeah, I think, Cloelle, you hit on a really good point. I think there's a lot of confusion out there about produced water and treated produced water. A lot of times people are talking about produced water and they actually mean treated produced water. A lot of times folks will come to me and say, I read this report on produced water. Is this a problem? And it's a report or a paper on produced water, not treated produced water. And I mean, just to be very clear here, we're not advocating or really talking about produced water at all. Raw produced water is not something we're discussing. We're really more interested in the treated produced water and evaluating potential risk associated with that.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And it ties really well to, again, podcast 3, where we talked about, those varying compositions and the constituents and of both treated produced water and produced water and how treatment fits in there to add another variable.
I think we can also talk about the multi-tiered analytical approach we have developed in the consortium. We have developed a comprehensive analytical list for characterization of the physical, chemical, and biological properties using a suite of analytical tools, including, for example, target analysis to know all the metals, radionuclides, organic constituents in water. We also use non-target analysis to identify the toxicity effects of those constituents or the treated produced water on the different aquatic life like bacteria, water fleas, and algae, and also zebrafish and other fish.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I'd just like to add on to that when you talk about hazard, one of the critical pieces is understanding what the hazard is, and that's why it is so critical to have what we've called, and I don't know if this is going to be its final name, but NPDES plus list that we've developed over the past several years, and that is a list that is helping us to define what is in produced water, what is in treated produced water, and make sure that we understand that and we're using best available technology to assess its potential hazard.
So, Josh, you used an acronym, NPDES Plus. What that means? NPDES is the US EPA issued permitting process to regulate the surface water discharge to prevent the degradation of water sheds and the water bodies. NPDES stands for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And in this comprehensive analytical list, we build upon the NPDES permitting standards, but we also considered the water quality requirements for beneficial use applications, such as what will be the water quality requirements for the agricultural irrigation, land application, industrial uses, and others.
Thanks for that, Pei.
And I just wanted to emphasize the importance of these whole effluent toxicity tests that you do at the back end. So you do your best to characterize everything that you might be concerned about. You test the water after you've treated it. You're never, as good as we try to do this, as well as we try to do this, we're never going to be able to characterize everything that's in produced water. And so it's really important to understand, is there any residual toxicological hazard, which we try to assess using these whole effluent toxicities, which also tries to sort of understand the cumulative effect of multiple constituents working together. So sometimes when you're exposed to more than one chemical at a time, they can have an additive effect, meaning they're more toxic than the sum of their parts, or they can actually have a subtractive effect, meaning they kind of cancel each other out. So it's really hard to predict that a priori, meaning we need these whole effluent toxicity assessments after the fact.
Now that we know a little bit about the substances that bring risk, let's talk about what we're doing to identify the risk. Let's start with the Risk and Toxicology group in the consortium. Who is this group and what does this group do? Josh.
Yeah, I'd be happy to introduce this topic. So I think from my perspective, this has been a really awesome collaboration between several groups of people. I mean, this certainly couldn't work without the collaborative atmosphere that we've created, not only in the risk and toxicology group, but then more so in the subgroup. I feel somewhat like a family almost. It's interesting how we quabble over certain issues, but nonetheless, it's really helpful to advance the science. We talk about what would put most people to sleep, but to us, it's important because we have a passion, because we're motivated. And just to talk a little bit more about the hazard side of the risk assessment framework is, the approach that we're taking is, look, it's practically not feasible to measure produced water 24/7. It's just not going to happen. We realize that there's spatial and temporal variability that will likely require things like wet testing, but the approach that we've taken thus far is to take a predictive modeling approach. And so really that's around, not now that we sort of understand the constituents of interest, modeling the concentration of those constituents in produced water, how does that stack up against their potential toxicity for different endpoints to the environment and then certainly to the public health, which Rose will likely talk about later.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Also, I should mention that we have our meetings on Friday, which should be terrible, but I kind of look forward to it, and it's a nice way to end the week. So I just wanted to take us back to the framework, just to, more fundamentally what we're trying to do here. And we're really replicating that GWPC framework, starting that evidence-based risk assessment is a vital component for informed decision making. So we need to create the evidence that we can hand over to NMED so that they can set appropriate standards. And we also need that to design appropriate treatment. That do we have sufficient understanding? Can we pull the constituents that we care about out of that water? Do we understand what we can treat them to? And then this is all really important because basing these assessments only on known constituents of concern, so things that these known baddies, probably not sufficient in this context. It's just these standards, these existing surface water or groundwater quality standards were designed with a very different waste in mind. So we kind of have to take a big fundamental step back, sort of reevaluate that list of chemicals, and then figure out what are the existing hazards associated with those chemicals.
Cloelle, can you also talk about just what the standards look like in the state of New Mexico?
Sure, and this I should say this similar across other states. Some of the work that we did at EDF is we developed a database of things that have been identified in produced water. We did a massive literature review, and that sort of first review, we identified about 1,200 produced water chemicals. That's a very caveated list. It only includes chemicals that have what are known as CAS numbers, which only matters because that allows us to crosswalk them to other databases, things like existing water quality standards or toxicity databases. So we know that that's not an all-inclusive list. It's also a national list, so it doesn't exactly apply to New Mexico perfectly, but it's a good starting point. So we took that database. Within those 1,200 chemicals, only about 90 of them have existing standards on the books in the state of New Mexico. In other states, that number is pretty consistent. It's about 100 chemicals that have surface water quality standards for human health and aquatic organisms. We also know that there's another additional 200 chemicals that we have toxicity data for that aren't included in those water quality standards that have been found in produced water. So there's a disconnect between what we have standards for or water quality criteria for and what we know is potentially hazardous. So again, taking a big step back from how we're evaluating this whole system, not using existing tools, but trying to really start from a more fundamental research, evidence-based paradigm.
Yeah, and hearing you describe the difference in the numbers there just shows the challenge ahead in terms of
those 1,200 chemicals. Not all of them are going to be in this produced water. Not all of them are of concern. It's not an all-inclusive list. It's just a starting point. So I know it's really scary sounding, but within that, we can do a lot to winnow down that list very quickly. But it is good to be aware of those 200 chemicals that we do have toxicity data that might be in produced water.
Yeah.
So that's the low-hanging fruit that we're trying to start with and then really expand outward from.
I also want to add on what Cloelle mentioned. So right now, the consortium is doing an extensive water quality analysis of the raw produced water and also treated produced water from the Permian Basin and the San Juan Basin. We did the target analysis. We are also doing the non-target analysis to see what other constituents are present in the produced water using the high-resolution analytical methods. We compare the identified compounds with the list that Cloelle is mentioned and has mentioned. And we are also looking at a very extensive database in the EPA and other database. Maybe we have about 250,000 compounds. So we are trying to identify what are the constituents in the produced water and the treated produced water.
Thanks for adding that in, Pei.
All right, so we spent a good deal of time talking about the hazard side of risk. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the exposure side, and maybe kicking us off first on the human health. Rose, you want to jump in?
Yeah, right. So we can't really think about what the human health impacts are going to be if we don't know what the exposures are. And Cloelle hit on this earlier. It's really important, evidence-based, right? We need to follow the scientific evidence and determine what potential constituents might cause human health impacts. And I think Josh can greatly expand on some of the techniques that they're developing within the consortium to help the Department of Health and also NMED think about mitigating or assessing potential human health impacts.
Yeah, I certainly can. I mean, when we start thinking about exposure assessments in the risk space, certainly we're talking about environmental and human health exposure. And this is currently the sort of the area where the subgroup in the consortium is focused on. And so a couple things that we needed to do to be successful executing this exposure assessment. The first thing was identify what the sensitive receptors were. Of course, they could be humans, it could be fish, it could be invertebrates, it could be plants, it could be earthworms. And interestingly enough, each of those sensitive receptors have a different risk associated with it. And really, one of the reasons why we not only focused on identifying the sensitive receptors, but what are the beneficial reuses? Are you using this water for irrigation purposes? Are you using this water for industrial uses? Are you using this water for construction uses? So the thing that makes this risk assessment much more complicated compared to others is just the variability of not only beneficial reuse scenarios that could be potentially used, but then also the sensitive receptors that could come into contact with the treated produced water. Similar to the hazard side, we've taken a predictive approach as well. And so, just kind of walking through the process, once we identify the constituents of potential concern, we would go through some emission factor testing, because not all of that a particular constituent's going to be in the air or in the soil or in the water. So based on its reuse, there could be a certain fraction that's in the air, a certain fraction that's in the water or soil. It just depends on that particular reuse. If you're surface water discharging, of course, most of it is going to be in the water compared to the air or the soil. Some of that will go into the sediment. So we use predictive modeling to understand the fate and distribution of a particular chemical in the environment. Once we have that predictive model set, we can then compare that to what we expect the concentration of an effect to be. And if then there is a concentration in the environment that's higher than that predicted effect, we know there's a potential problem there because the concentration in the environment is greater than what we're saying the predicted effect concentration might be. So that's kind of how we're using predictive technology to evaluate the potential risk of treated produced water. And I mean, to Cloelle's point earlier, predictive models are always wrong. We know that. We use them to inform our decisions, but in reality, we're going to need to use other technologies like wet testing to confirm our modeled predictions.
To be fair, Josh, I don't think I actually said it in this meeting, but it is a thing that I've said so many times to Josh that I think he's just internalized that. But yes, I will reiterate that here, that when you have both predictive modeling in terms of what is the toxicological hazard, as well as what is the predicted exposure, you have compounding uncertainties. And so part of this whole process is pulling in those uncertainties, and then sort of you basically divide it all by a couple orders of magnitude to make sure that you feel confident that you're nowhere near that potential level of hazard if you're exposed to it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, one of the things that we flagged in the group and we talk about on a regular basis are what are the assumptions that are going into our framework and where are the uncertainties in this framework? And those are the areas where we kind of need to tighten up our data so that when we look to conduct new experiments, we're conducting those experiments with that in mind to answer those hypotheses where we have uncertainties.
Yeah, and to Rose's point about evidence-based hazard, we're not going to necessarily have all of this really robust toxicology data. We know, for example, that benzene is a human carcinogen based on literally 100 years of study. A lot of these chemicals, we're just sort of understanding that they might be present. So even if we have a chemical that's identified in produced water and we can't say too much about its toxicity beyond what we've modeled, we might understand that it's persistent in the environment, or we might predict that it's bioaccumulative. With those sorts of chemicals that we know will stick around either in the environment or in our bodies, we're going to be pretty cautious with those types of chemicals.
And this should be an evolving process, right? This isn't just a point in time. The modeling, the scientific efforts of the consortium are going to continue so that we can improve our decision making based on what's being found.
All right, so let's talk about what is the goal of the consortium subcommittee here?
Yeah, the goal is really simple. It's to create a transparent risk assessment framework to inform risk management decisions.
This framework will be so important to inform the regulatory agencies, stakeholders to make informed decisions. This will also be very important for the engineers to design the effective treatment trains to remove the harmful constituents that may affect public health and the environment. I think this framework would be also useful for the general public to understand what are the risks of using the treated produced water.
Thanks, Pei. All right, with that, let's go around again and hear any closing comments you may have. Cloelle, let's start with you.
I guess the only thing that I would want to say is that, in terms of developing this evidence-based assessment of sort of the hazards, then we can think about what the potential exposure. In the world of produced water, we've really only been thinking about what's in produced water in the last 15 years, ever since sort of the shale boom. So we're in the process of an iterative generation of sort of the research phase as well as the assessment phase. So the first two phases of a standard risk assessment paradigm that we then can pass off to somebody to make these decisions to manage that risk, which is the third phase of the risk management paradigm.
Good points. I mean, that takes us directly back to the conversation that you started around the GWPC.
And I would just like to bounce off of what Pei mentioned, the importance of involving stakeholders. And really one of the important roles of public health is to communicate with stakeholders. And we're working within the consortium to do that through a variety of mechanisms. And most importantly, as Pei had mentioned, the public is a very vital stakeholder to this process. And so the consortium is working to do that through different mechanisms like what we're doing today, like this podcast, and also public-facing workshop and many other sort of
Outreach efforts.
Yes, thank you.
I was following.
Pei, any closing remarks from you?
Yes, I just feel that this research is so important for safe use of treated produced water for beneficial use applications, especially for New Mexico, because we need additional water and also to reduce the use of fresh water. The consortium is really fortunate to work with the toxicologists, the researchers, and the scientists from academia, environmental groups, industry, and the Environmental Protection Agency to understand the potential risks and toxic effects of treated produced water.
Thank you all so much for being here. Today is a really interesting discussion, and it was clear throughout the discussion that the work that you guys are doing is very important. It's very important and can have really big impact for not only the state of New Mexico, but for the oil and gas industry, for a number of industries and a number of agencies, and of course, and most important, the general public, and our environment. So, thank you for taking us through that today. Just want to, before we wrap up, remind our audience again that the consortium is really focused around solving water challenges through innovation and collaboration. This is episode number 4. Be on the lookout for episode number 5, where we will dive deeper.
Thanks for joining us.